7. The Founding of ACT. How to Live College Life. Time is no friend of the procrastinator. In college, it kept passing by, and on its way out, it always reminded me that the luxury of college living was finite. I had to find a path to some sort of career back in the Caribbean. I was not alone in this apprehension. Most of my colleagues at Cornell University had come to the same conclusion. It was getting close to that time when we all had to leave the comforts of student living and join the rest of our kin, getting by as best as we can in ordinary time. The vehicle for discussing these fears, at least openly, was the Caribbean Students Association at Cornell. In the early days of this club, we would bring interesting professionals from the Caribbean to join us in a debate on some topic of interest to Caribbean development. This time, we were engaged in a sharp debate among ourselves about the pros and cons of returning to build a career in the Caribbean. Sometimes we wondered just how our counterparts in the University of the West Indies were dealing with such issues. Surely they were having the same debate, but not with the same parameters that we were facing. We were already in the USA, where a moderate standard of living was much easier to achieve than in the Caribbean. In fact, the Caribbean countries, most of them independent by this time, were all struggling to replicate the amenities of middle-class living that we, who were now residing in the USA, took for granted. I was not part of the clarion call that we must return to our island of birth. Few of my associates may have considered me to be apolitical in this respect, and subsequently expressed some anger and frustration towards me. The truth is, I was never one for bigging up Guyana. Neither Jagan nor Burnham were my heroes nor my guiding star. I had lived through at least 5 elections and I had never voted. I recall the Guyana election of 1968. It was the first general election after independence in May 1966, and the last to be conducted before Guyana acceded to Republican status on February 23, 1970. Although this was the second election under the system of proportional representation, it was also the first election where, through postal ballots, the Guyanese diaspora was permitted to participate in electing the country's decision makers. It was Christmas time. I was on holiday in New York and made inquiries at the consulate's office in New York about my ballot. The sweet-talking attendant on the other side of the call informed me that I had nothing to worry about. Not only had I been recorded as having voted, but hooray, I must have voted for the winning party. From that moment onwards, the political arguments for returning to that Guyana fell on deaf ears. However, I had to respond to the economic arguments, which went like this. The material expectations of middle-class educated elite back home were the same as those here in the USA. A house, refrigerator, stove, household utensils, and cars were all available there. As a result, living in the Caribbean was more expensive than staying here in the US. Our only course of action was to buy these items prior to departure and then repatriate ourselves and our material comforts, a rather high-cost investment. A stumbling block to such repatriation was either of inferior quality or more expensive. My Trinidadian friends talked enthusiastically about the new high-low that had been opened up in Diego Martin. Similarly, my Dominican friends would speak about Brisbane and Astafan. At that time, I had no idea what a high-low was. When I left BG, we bought our food in the kitty market and we were all cooking on kerosene stoves. The logic of the solution to the food issue was obvious. We needed to create a cadre of technically skilled persons who would commit themselves to helping the small farmers of the Caribbean produce more food for themselves and the educated elite. As the time of reckoning was drawing nigh, we needed to build a structure for action, not for talking. The founding of ACT. By the spring of 1972, some of us in Cornell had assembled the building blocks for just such an action group. We called ourselves ACT, suggesting that the time for talking had long passed. Its founding members were as follows: Alan Williams, Guyana, serving as coordinator of the group. My main qualification was not so much that I was the originator of the group, but more that I was the only one in the group that was not married at that time. Born Draper, Trinidad and Tobago, graduated an MBA in Business Administration from Cornell, taught at the University of the West Indies, and finally became Minister of Public Administration in the government. Louis Bertrand, Trinidad and Tobago, had just arrived from Trinidad to Cornell to pursue a course in the management of health administration. He later became one of the top pollsters in Trinidad and Tobago. Bernadette Farquhar, Antigua, graduated as a linguist, very familiar with the different Creole languages in the region. By 1975, she had authored a book on the grammar of Antiguan Creole language and went on to author books on the French language in Guadeloupe and women's quest for equality. Titon Martin Dominica, an agronomist and environmentalist. He was later awarded the Goldman Environment Prize in 1988 for his unflinching efforts to stop an exploration for copper which threatened to destroy the prime forests of Dominica. Winston Carew, an agronomist, played a leading role in the international efforts of a church group called Agricultural Missions, especially in support of reconstruction and rebuilding efforts following the brutal wars in Africa. Vincent Richards, Antigua, economist, who founded his own Lorijos Management Consulting Limited and went on to fulfill some very important roles in the Eastern Caribbean. ACT was initiated in the spring of 1972 at the home of Winston Carew in Miami Gardens, Florida. Winston had graduated from Cornell and had just moved to Florida with his new wife. I remember myself, Hattie, and Louis Bertrand flying down to Florida from Ithaca, New York for this event. I think Vincent Richards joined us coming in from Indiana University. Winston's house, between drinks and the warmer climate in Miami, we decided to call our organization ACT. Our organization names are usually the acronym of the long form, but we had the acronym before we could determine what the long form will be. Of course, I was very familiar with such minor infringements of protocol, having seen it played out in the OI committee's name. Having chosen the acronym, we decided that it would stand for Association for Caribbean Transformation. Even though it was not really an association in the true sense of the word, it was registered as a limited liability company specifically so that it could receive donations. The mission of ACT was clear: to offer technical assistance free of charge to small farmers in the region to improve their productivity as well as their economic well-being. The financing of this venture, however, was not as clear as its name and mission. Here, in a contorted manner, we had to find funds to pay for the initial investigation of the technical needs of the farmers and then to finance the delivery of such technical services. Financing ACT's operations. I don't remember where our first funding came from, but early in the process, we had acquired major funding from such organizations as the Inter-American Foundation, IAF, and Oxfam Canada. Occasionally, we would encounter those who, in their arrogance, thought that we were just a group chasing after money, and as such, would try to manipulate our program as part of the exchange. Such group was the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, whose director tried an old tactic of divide and rule by encouraging our Antiguan contingent, by that time led by Tim Hector, to question why we were not allocating more funds to his activity. The problem we had with Tim was that his entire organization had one objective, and that was politics, while we wanted to make local food supplies more available. We supported a farm run by his organization in Antigua, and I can attest to the many times I visited and helped to put on stakes for fencing the area, while few of Tim's political compatriots were ever seen. There were two streams of funding that were required for ACT's work to be accomplished. The first was the need to raise funds to pay for ACT's direct technical support. This was primarily funding my participation as the technical coordinator. This is where I developed my talent for writing projects. While every project was technically different, there was a common logic to my approach. Firstly, I was consumed in analyzing with the recipient group what they could meaningfully accomplish in the immediate short run. This would lead to the composition of a technical support program. The second effort was directed at funding the farmer group itself. Once this program had been specified and the funding in place, it became my duty to write an ACT proposal to engage the ACT resource personnel in the upcoming activity. This model had its own symmetry. Our funders were eager to fund us because they could see where and how our intervention could bear fruit. Their funding sources were also on board because the involvement of our technical skills was expected to improve the chances of a meaningful outcome. Importantly, the receiving group did not have to show any reliance on the government for assistance. For instance, many farmers found it convenient to use our approach to increase their production and trade. This included such ACT support like market price forecasts, identifying market opportunities, and techniques to increase yields. These were the sorts of things that farmers would traditionally plead for from the agricultural infrastructure. First visit to Dominica. Dominica came into my scenario in an unexpected way. The first Dominicans that I had ever met were Faye and Athi Martin. Athi had just transferred into Cornell University in 1970, coming from Skill College, an accredited polytechnic college. Although I had arrived in Cornell the same year, just a few days earlier, I had driven up from Oxford, Ohio, and had mobility around the town. Soon, I was assisting Athi and Faye and also Gordon Draper and his new wife with transportation to the grocery store in downtown Ithaca. As things would develop, I was planning to spend part of my summer 1971 with relatives in Trinidad. And knowing this, Athi suggested that I visit with his parents in Roseau, Dominica. It was my first visit to the island, and I remember Pops, that is Athi's dad, asking me how I found the place, meaning what were my impressions. Snakes and ladders were my immediate impression. The roads were winding, not straight, and at every bend we seemed to be climbing a mountain or descending from one. This was not an odd impression for someone coming from BG. Georgetown is totally flat. We saw no mountains on the horizon. Georgetown was a city full of bicyclists. Here in Dominica, it would be dangerous to try riding a bicycle down one of these mountains. My second visit to Dominica. At the time of Athi's graduation from Cornell in 1972, we had already set up the structure of ACT. Athi's new job as manager of an estate at Castle Bruce would become our first venture. 1972 is also remembered as the first year of the Caribbean Festival of Arts, called Cari Festa, which was held in Guyana. An old comrade from my Miami University days, Leonard Harris, who was pursuing a PhD in philosophy at Cornell, was keen on attending this festival. We decided to make a Caribbean vacation out of these events with the intentions of visiting our friends in Antigua and Dominica on our way to Guyana. Dominica was to be the high point of our trip because our compatriot Afi had just moved into the great house. My imagination, a privilege reserved for the estate manager. One of the sad things about reading history written by colonials is that it tends to focus on the nicer things of plantation life, such as the great house and the sumptuous meals of the slave master. It seldom focuses on the less important but real rumblings that were likely to lead to social eruption. It was these rumblings that awaited myself and Leonard when we arrived in Dominica in August 1972. With high expectation of a memorable holiday in the estate house, now occupied by our friend Ati Mata and his wife, we were very disappointed to find out that the grandeur of this great house would be ours to enjoy for less than 6 hours. The first words we heard upon arriving in the driveway was Ati saying, "Don't unpack, guys, we can't stay here." How would we have known that lurking behind the surface was a combustible set of unsettling tensions?